Now we move on to our first segment of the month in the form of the sad news that the huge Beirut blast, the explosion which seemingly uh, was so stunning that some people even thought it might be a nuclear blast, some sort of low yield nuclear explosion, but actually turned out to be poorly stored. Was it ammonium nitrate?
Ammonium nitrate that
Yeah,
had been destined for fertilizer to be used as fertilizer in Africa. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
That this blast not only devastated homes and lives and businesses, but also has damaged dozens of historic buildings in the Lebanese capital, and left them at risk of collapse. Now, the byline here in the Guardian coverage said that UNESCO has vowed to lead a global effort to rescue culture and heritage of Beirut, and the FBI has offered to join the inquiry to investigate the cause of the massive port town blast. Um, this obviously for very different reasons has echoes, for example, of the fires that we've seen in Brazilian museums as well, doesn't it? It's a terrible cultural loss in that sense, or cultural damage, certainly. But also, before we go into it, we should just reiterate clearly help and monetary aid needs to go to people and their lives first. We're not saying that this is more important than that, but this is nonetheless a side effect of this story, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the figures are absolutely stark. And I remember I was actually, I mean, actually, I'm at the moment. I was working at home with the telly on in the background, and I normally have a, you know, because I'm sad like that. I normally have a 24-hour rolling news channel on in the background. And around, I think it was around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the report started coming in from Beirut that there'd been this explosion, and
Mm,
then they started switch. Uh, they went over live, and it was almost it was as shocking as the evening that Notre Dame caught fire,
mm,
because you're out of nowhere. You're suddenly seeing the effects of basically 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate going bang, and I mean the estimate is around 170 to 200 people killed, 6,000 injured. The health services overwhelmed, partly because the hospitals were very
mm,
severely damaged.
mm,
And the current estimate on damage is 10 to 15 billion. And
mm,
this is in a country that has been racked by civil war, has barely a functioning government, which is people argue is behind the explosion in the first place. That this
mm,
stuff was offloaded from a ship that was impounded,
mm.
and then effectively forgotten about by the system. Although some individuals appear to have tried to flag up warnings that this stuff was unsafe, and certainly unsafe to be stored in the middle of a busy port in the middle of the capital of the country.
2,750 tons of it. I mean,
Yep.
that's crackers, in so much as the potential for an explosion. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and given that it degrades over time, becomes more unstable,
Mm,
and then on top to compound it, and we can talk about it a bit later, but immediately it fed into the conspiracy world as well. So there were even doctored videos allegedly showing a missile hitting the warehouse that the stuff was in.
right.
Um, and then Hezbollah done it, or the Israelis done it,
Mm,
or various other conspiracy theories came up online, when in fact it just appears to be a colossal human cock up,
yeah.
exacerbated by a system that wasn't working.
And it's interesting.
But yeah,
Just briefly on that point. It's interesting that this seems to happen with alarming speed as well. The sort of doctored images and willful misrepresentation of footage. I'm reminded of the during the as it was still ongoing, the fire in Paris,
yes,
uh,
it's done.
Notre Dame. That's it. Yeah, the cathedral, the wonderful
Yeah,
cathedral. Just like brain work. I remember that there was footage that someone was purporting to show someone in robes traveling around one of the towers in Notre Dame, essentially trying to stir up a conspiracy theory that this was an Islamist attack on Christendom, as it were,
yes,
in um, a notably non-religious state. It's a strange target to have. But anyway, the point is, people seem to want to stir up these sorts of things quite quickly, and often they do it in the form of doctored footage, and often it's also done to further other conspiracy theories. In the case of the damaged historic buildings, the estimated cost from the culture minister, or the Ministry of Culture, led by Abbas Murtada, is said to be around $300 million. Um, he added that teams from his ministry were developing plans to renovate the buildings, although around 60 of them have been left at risk of collapse out of more than 600 buildings which had been damaged, which were under their care. The World Bank, in a preliminary assessment, said around 50,000 residential units were damaged and 80% of residential buildings and infrastructure were affected by the blast, aside from the destruction of the port.
And I think, sorry,
So
go
go
on.
ahead.
No, I was going to say, no, I think the thing to stress here, we're not talking about a destructive sort of conflagration like we saw at Notre Dame or in the cases in Rio in Brazil. What we're looking at here is the effect of blast.
Yeah,
And
that's the
as
pressure
we're talking
wave.
about the pressure wave that is generated by an explosion.
Mm.
And it is impossible really to explain quite how powerful something like that can be. You just have to see the results. I mean, you might be familiar with some of the high-speed camera footage that was taken during the nuclear tests of the effect of a nuclear blast wave.
Yeah. Or
Conventional explosion blast.
for example, MythBusters as well. They have some wonderful slow footage of a
Yeah.
propagation of a wave. There was one when, not to get too off topic, but there was one when they were testing the myth of whether or not someone fell out of well, they did actually fall out of a bomber and land in a train station just as a bomb went off. And seemingly in this one instance, this person was saved by that upward pressure wave, despite the explosion. Isn't that amazing? They couldn't replicate it though in the myth, but we saw this amazing. The air moves basically. Everything moves out of the way of the explosion, and that's the damage.
And basically, just the air around you effectively turns into a huge battering ram.
Mm.
And I'm looking at, as we're talking, I'm looking at photographs, which we'll link to. It's an article in The Guardian, in fact, of the Archaeosoup Palace in Beirut, which is this incredibly elegant townhouse that was built by one of the leading citizens of Beirut in the 1860s, and it's now a museum. It's 3 floors. It's a colonnaded portico. It's got grand, sort of picture windows on its upper floors and so on. Really elegant interiors, marble pillars, Islamic arches and so on. It's now a museum and gallery.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the pictures, there isn't a window left intact. Everything's been blown inwards. The frames have come away and been blown inwards. Fragments of glass and wood and plaster from the shop. It is in, and large parts of the roof off as well, tiled roof.
Well, for me, one of the photo where the chap's holding up a comparison image in the image and showing
Yes,
where a veranda has been blown back into the building. For
into the
me,
building, absolutely.
it's strangely interesting from an architectural standpoint, because it shows actually that was essentially probably a wooden or at least a thinner facade around the
Yes.
veranda, and you've got more solid stone or brick structures on either side. But that's an archaeological inquiry, niche thing to be interested in. But nonetheless, it shows the force of that wave just pushed through the building essentially in that direction. It's quite astonishing. Where does this leave? Does this leave international efforts then? I mean, is this yet another thing that we're going to be having
Well,
to ask people to I don't say that with rolling eyes, but essentially this isn't the first time that in this watching brief we've said keep an eye out, support where you can, essentially.
of course.
Mm,
I mean, obviously, organisations like UNESCO are
mm,
involved. There are large parts of Beirut which are, heavily, protected their heritage sites. Other bits much more modern.
mm,
But for example, the Federal Agency for Technical Relief in Germany is already involved. The French government is heavily involved with the Lebanese government in trying to reconstruct a functioning bureaucracy that's capable of handling this and a government that actually works.
Mm.
Because the government was thoroughly discredited by this event, particularly when it became clear that it had been warned on a number of occasions that this was possible.
Yeah. Well, and also
So
in the context as well of not only, as you say, the recent conflict, but also essentially a collapsing economy as well. This is a
absolutely,
very difficult scenario.
absolutely, and against the background of COVID as well, like
Mm.
everywhere else in the world.
Mm.
Um, so the really sad thing is that I talked about the Sursok Palace as the case study here. It had been just coming to the end of a 20-year restoration project that had been put in place as the Lebanese civil war came to an end in the early 90s.
Mm.
So all that effort is suddenly literally blown away.
Well, literally, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Uh, yeah, I mean, I suppose it's something to keep an eye on, as is Brazil, as is Paris. You know, all these other. It's a as is uh yeah. We were talking about sites in and around Syria as well. There's so much to keep an eye on at the moment in terms of.
And again, below the radar, and again, it's something that UNESCO have been talking about, and other international organisations. But the civil war in Yemen is ongoing, and again, some
Mm.
very important heritage sites there are at risk or have already been damaged. So it's looking around the world, it's quite a depressing sight at the moment, and a huge test for the international organisations and the international heritage community. Where, and obviously, you're quite right to highlight at the beginning of this package, of this segment, the fact that people's lives are the most important thing. It's most important for Lebanon to get Beirut back as a functioning city for its inhabitants.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
like us here in London, and you up there in the northeast, we live
In the wilds of
in
the north.
waiting for the pigs to come over the border. But no, we live alongside our heritage, and
Yeah,
I think this is an example of how fragile it can be.
yeah, absolutely.